Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Progressive American. I'm Connor, back with another morning podcast about the week's news from a progressive perspective. Welcome back to the show. It is October 30th, 2021, and today we are talking about a rising coup in Sudan, charges against Andrew Cuomo, and how the organizers of Charlottesville are now on trial. With that out of the way, let's get into it. Yet another coup has risen and brought another democracy to its knees. Sudan's democratic government was overthrown on Monday as the country's military arrested the civilian government, including the Prime Minister, Abdallah Hamdok. The top commander of Sudan's military, Lieutenant General Abdallah Fattah al-Burhan, has announced the new control that the military has created, although he has avoided explaining where exactly these civilians are being held. Protesters took to the streets, and security forces have clashed with these protesters. In response, the Biden administration has suspended its previous plans to provide $700 million in aid to the country, warning that any aid is conditional upon the release of civilian leadership. The end of Sudan's democratic system, which began in 2019 with that same military overthrowing Omar Bashir, is a shock to the world and is yet another tragic example of democracies falling around the world. It is also a warning about how democracy comes to be and how it can be destroyed in the midst of revolution. Prior to the civilian government's end, it gave the military a deadline to accept a fully established civilian government. In other words, the civilian institutions tried to compel the military to uphold its end of the bargain, and instead, the military reset the system with yet another coup. Without the means to enforce its institutional values, Sudan's government quickly crumbled and is now at the behest of a totalitarian military force. This story is very reminiscent of what happened in Myanmar. There was an uneasy truce between the civilian government and the military, although it doesn't seem to be in the same racialized or religious element that would be present in Myanmar. What's concerning about this is how easy it is for a military force to overtake a democratic system when it does not consider that democratic system legitimate. With Sudan, the world was hoping that maybe in 2 or 3 years we could see a stable democracy that was able to maintain its own right, but instead it's being held at the behest of people that nobody elected. And as far as I've been able to find, there's no reason to believe that this government will allow a civilian government to return or any sort of democratic control. It's unclear how the Biden administration will respond to this, and it is even more unclear what is the proper response. We don't really know what this government wants, what the military truly hopes to achieve in its current approach. But what is important is that we don't go into this with a reactionary or dismissive approach. Americans, unfortunately, don't tend to pay attention to foreign policy or things like this unless it directly affects us in terms of a security threat. And while I understand that would be a mistake when we're looking at the world stage and how it is constantly changing. Seeing any democracy fall is disturbing, not only because it can happen here, but because it represents a change in the global order. That democracy and the principles of political and social rights can be thrust away by brute force. And this is where I think the Biden administration has to be careful. On the one hand, the instinct is to intervene, to do something forcefully about this illegal coup. But on the other hand, there needs to be some considerations as to what that would actually do. We currently don't know where the Prime Minister of Sudan is or if he's even alive. So the best approach right now is restraint, examination, and consideration about what the United States' interest is and what the humanitarian interest is. If there are refugees that are leaving Sudan who are trying to escape this tyranny, then by all means I think the United States should do what it can to bring those people in if they so choose to be here. But in the meantime, the United States needs to keep a careful, critical, and restrained eye on Sudan, and you should too, because the world is getting more interconnected and more dangerous by the day if we don't pay attention to it. In social media news, Facebook is once again facing controversy for its failures to regulate its platform, with violence coming out of all of it. New leaks reveal that Facebook's failures aren't really failures, but are key components of Facebook's profit motive. It has unfortunately been incentivizing the very thing that they claim to fight against, hatred and misinformation. Reports by the Washington Post and the International Consortium of Journalists show that Facebook was not enforcing its policies of moderation when the policy proved inconvenient. One example of this was Facebook making the angry reaction on a post worth more than a standard like. This means that Facebook was using its algorithm to promote negative content even when they had previously claimed that they were doing their best to deal with misinformation and hatred and violent speech. And this is not new, mind you. The Washington Post reports that other Facebook affiliates have had similar issues in the past. One report showed that misinformation on WhatsApp contributed to a mob killing in India. The Guardian reported in 2019 that Facebook was one of the leading apps that helped spread anti-Muslim lies during the genocidal attacks against the Rohingya community in Myanmar. This in turn led to a mass exodus from the country. And part of the reason for this is that Facebook, being unwilling to take responsibility for its contributions to the world, did not pay as much attention to other nations in the same way that it did in the United States. It didn't even have an office in Myanmar during the Rohingya crisis, and even less translators to deal with the mess of information when it was coming. Now, it's one thing to complain constantly about Facebook, and it's well-deserved. Mark Zuckerberg's contributions to politics have been less than ideal, to put it lightly. But one thing that needs to be said is how utterly deceptive Facebook is. Right now, they're trying to rebrand to Meta, which is the weirdest statement and weirdest title I've ever heard, but that's not the point. Facebook is trying to rebrand itself in the face of all this controversy. It's consistently tried to downplay the severity of what it's doing or how it's hurting other people in a way that makes it profitable for them. So when you hear things like someone robs a store because they heard a conspiracy theory about the store, chances are it's on Facebook. So when you hear this in the United States, it's bad. But because Facebook doesn't really care about what happens in other countries that it is affiliated with, it won't invest in actually moderating its policies just overseas. And that's a problem because the world is becoming more and more interconnected. Things that happen in Myanmar affect the United States. Things that happen in China affect Myanmar. It affects India. It affects the world. So Facebook fundamentally does not want to actually contribute to the world because it is profitable not to. Remember, I mentioned earlier that the like and dislike algorithm that Facebook has set up, negative content tends to get more reactions, which means more opportunities for advertisers, which means more money for Facebook, which means more money they can put into new programs to buy out other social media companies, and by extension, more money for Mark Zuckerberg to make while other people pay the price of this misinformation and nonsense. And that's not even getting into what Facebook is doing in the United States. They had a task force specifically focused on getting rid of misinformation regarding the 2020 election. But after the election, they disbanded that task force. They did not continue their moderation policies against all the nonsensical misinformation that has been spreading for years. And part of the reason they do that is because nobody's watching. Half the time, they will be saying that they're concerned with educating the populace, making sure that people are informed. But once they can do the bare minimum and they don't have to do it anymore because nobody's watching, they'll go right back down to hiding their algorithm, pretending there isn't something insidious going on. So ultimately, the issue with Facebook isn't just that it's Mark Zuckerberg running the show. It's that the algorithm and the system itself that makes money for Facebook is fundamentally blocked and not transparent. You don't get to see how the algorithm works until somebody in the news reports on it. And as a consumer, do you really want to have to deal with that kind of system, especially when you know that that system can sometimes contribute to lies and deceit? I think not. And this is going to be difficult to deal with. Like, the government has never really dealt with an institution like Facebook. It has never dealt with a global force of corporate control like this before. And I know, in the face of all of this, it can seem remarkably terrifying to talk about this and depressing. It seems like there's nothing we can do. And there are limits to our power. However, if there were a movement to attack Facebook's advertisers, to make it untenable to advertise on Facebook, that would be a good place to start. I'll admit, I use Facebook. It's one of the largest organizations in social media. But if if all of us at once were to go against it and push back on this and make it unprofitable to continue this method of business, then we might actually get somewhere. But if that doesn't happen, there's not going to be a lot of pushback. We can have committee hearings up our wazoo, but it doesn't change what's actually happening. There needs to be grassroots opposition to this, and it needs to hit Mark Zuckerberg's wallet. 4 years ago, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville terrified the nation. The faces of hatred, prejudice, and division showed themselves to the world that day and forced the United States to come to terms, or at the very least, acknowledge that we have a problem. This display of vile prejudice and bigotry was not just a display of poor aesthetics or optics. It was a representation of what we had ignored for so long. The prejudice and racism that undergird our system and undergird our population is here. Was shown for everybody to see. But after years of debate, obfuscation, false equivalencies, and downright lies about what happened on that day, consequences are finally coming. Men like Richard Spencer, who helped organize the rally and coin the term alt-right, are now being brought before civil court to defend themselves against liability for the death and destruction that came with that rally. Richard Spencer is being targeted with an age-old tactic that the SPLC and numerous other organizations have used to deal with the far right, going for their wallets. What they're doing is they're suing them for their assets and pursuing it in a way that allows them to possibly take control of them. If successful, that means this lawsuit will be the death of the organizations that Richard Spencer and others like him help support. Mind you, this does not mean that it is the end of racism or anything close to it. What it does mean, however, is that there will be consequences for the crimes committed by men like Spencer, men who are willing to create white ethno-states at the expense of other people. Now, the lawsuit is ongoing, but the reason I bring this up is to make a point about how we can push back. A lot of times people will just say, oh yeah, there's this prejudice person. You just gotta ignore them. They'll die out or something like that. Or whatever nonsensical reassurance we give to ourselves. But the truth is that we have the power to stop these kinds of people. These kinds of lawsuits were common for a long time, decades ago. And yet, they are now being brought back because they're necessary again. So, I'm not sure what is going to be the result of this lawsuit. I don't know if Richard Spencer is going to be found guilty or if his colleagues are going to be found guilty and liable for this. But if successful, there needs to be more lawsuits like this. If you have any evidence that somebody at a far-right rally is responsible for contributing to violence, incentivizing it, or any of this kind of thing, go for their wallet. Don't go to the court to get them arrested. Go for their wallet. That's where their money is. That's where their power is. That's what makes them able to organize. That's what makes them organizers. You cannot organize a rally if you can't pay for gas, if you can't find a place to stay, and if you can't find a place to eat. And that is where we will strike. If people really want to see change and end this kind of far-right extremism that's out in your face, aggressive and violent, that is the point. That is the point where we need to strike, and that is where we need to focus from now on. In more scandalous news, former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has been charged with a sex crime. Cuomo, who left office in August, has been on the down low, presumably planning to regain his office in an upcoming election or to challenge somebody else in the future. But the charges coming out of Albany suggest that that is not going to happen anytime soon. While it is unclear what will come of this so far, the fact that someone with that much power is being charged at all is a sign of progress. It's small, it's perhaps even insignificant to some, but that needs to keep happening. Nobody is entitled to public office, and nobody is entitled to be free from the consequences of their actions. Andrew Cuomo, I'm guessing, assumed that if he left office, that would be the end of it. After all, he sacrificed his precious desk. What more could the public ask of him? And that's the kind of thinking that has been going on in politics for far too long. There is a certain element, a certain presumption of entitlement that somebody like Andrew Cuomo is entitled to their position. And if they step down, which is the most basic thing you could do when you do something like this, is somehow a sign of good grace, is just ridiculous. There needs to be a fundamental restructuring of the way we think about people like Andrew Cuomo, but also how we think about the offices they hold in the first place. Because otherwise, this stuff will continue in perpetuity. We have to change the system, or the system will change us. The anti-Trump wing of the Republican Party is growing thinner and thinner by the day. Adam Kinzinger, one of 10 Republicans who opposed Donald Trump and voted to impeach him the last time around, is not seeking re-election in his district. This is yet another example of the anti-Trump elements of the Republican Party being weak and not willing to put up a fight or investment in their party. Maybe it's because it's already too late, or because they don't care anymore. But the fact of the matter is, there is no Republican Party that does not belong to Trump. In a statement, Adam Kinzinger explained that the reason for his leaving is the politics of his party and the politics of America. In this day and age, he said, to prevail or survive, you must belong to a tribe, unquote. That kind of message, while nice on face, is just another example of the sophistry of some of these anti-Trump Republicans. This was a systemic problem with them. Trump was an extension of years of conspiracism, and yet Adam Kinzinger, as he's leaving office, is saying it's about tribalism. No, there are not both sides here anymore. Donald Trump had to be impeached twice for his misconduct, and Kinzinger voted once alongside with Democrats to do that. But not once has he actively pushed back from within the party to take it back from Trump. You can make the media appearances all you like, but you have to question how you got here, Adam. And the fact that you're running, like many of the Republicans will soon, is an example of how shallow the party became even before Trump. So if this story is to be representative of anything, if it's to be representative of where this country is going, let this be the one lesson you take from this, everybody. No anti-Trump Republican Party actually exists anymore. You'll have Kinzinger on shows like MSNBC with Rachel Maddow, or you'll have him on CNN, and they'll talk about how the Republican Party has lost its graces, or any other sort of talking point like that. But there won't be any mention of the disrespect that John Kerry received, or the lies that the Bush administration perpetuated, or the attacks on the media that were consistently propagated by people like Bill O'Reilly and his allies at Fox News. This was a long time coming, and Kinzinger was a beneficiary of it. They all were. So let's not pretend that the Republican Party suddenly went crazy and joined Donald Trump. There was always an element to this. It's just showing its face now. That's all for this week's episode. Thank you all for joining me. If you enjoyed the episode, feel free to share it with your friends and family. If you want to see more content outside of the podcast, consider checking out the website. It is www.progressive-american.com. All of my content is there, including this podcast, my YouTube, and the newsletter. If you want to see all my content or talk to me directly, you can comment there. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.